My Lords, I regret to inform the House of the death of the noble Baroness Thatcher on April the 8th. On behalf of the House, I extend our most sincere condolences to the noble Baroness's family and friends.
My Lords, I rise to pay tribute to the late Baroness Thatcher. As I do so, I'm conscious that here in our House there are many who helped Lady Thatcher shape our political history and who stood alongside her shoulder to shoulder. There are those who took the other side of the argument. There are those who served politicians of all sides with great distinction and in the best traditions of our public service. But whatever our views and whatever our backgrounds, I think we would all agree that she made a huge difference to the country she loved, that she helped to pick Britain up off its knees, that she changed our place in the world, and that she transformed the very shape of our political debate. And I think we would also agree that she was a staunch defender of our parliamentary system and the part that it should play in our national life. The personal journey that she made, particularly at that time, from the grocer's shop in Grantham to the highest office in our land, was a truly remarkable one. The outlines of that journey are, of course, well known. Margaret Hilda Roberts was born in Grantham in 1925. Head girl of her grammar school, she went to Oxford during the war, graduating with a degree in chemistry. In 1951, she met and married Dennis, the rock of her life for more than 50 years. In 1953, she gave birth to twins, Carol and Mark, to whom we extend our deepest condolences, along with the rest of her family and her many friends. Having entered Parliament in 1959, she was in the Cabinet by 1970. Even today, 11 years from first election to the Cabinet would seem swift. But 50 years ago, as one of just a handful of female MPs, it was extraordinary. Even more remarkably, by 1975, this non-establishment figure had become leader of the establishment party, confounding the predictions of many. Those same people then foretold a quick exit. They foretold her never reaching the steps of number 10. And in fact, she herself said that she believed she would never see a woman Prime Minister in her lifetime. How she proved them, and indeed herself, wrong. But these bare bones of fact do not, of course, explain the reason for her success. They do not capture the strength of her personality, the beam of the spotlight, the force of her will that I remember vibrating through the government departments where I worked in the 1980s. Nor, I think, can we measure the extent of her achievements without first understanding the grim inheritance of the 1970s. Successive governments had tried and failed to tackle our economic and political woes. We had become the sick man of Europe. People asked, not fancifully, whether Britain was indeed possible to govern. We were a divided country, and at times our very future seemed to hang in the balance. That is the background against which the sifting process of history will make its judgments. That is the background which I think helps to explain her approach and which makes her achievements stand out so clearly. She did not take the easy way. She certainly did not take the consensual way. She led because of belief, she was guided by conviction, and she was harnessed to the purpose of making Britain great again. Tough economic policies were needed to turn the country round. She knew that the status quo was unsustainable and that some things had to change. Her programme of deregulation, of denationalisation and reducing the power of trade unions was painful, particularly in some parts of our country. But they did make Britain a global competitor once again. The recapture of the Falkland Islands, her resistance to the IRA, despite the high price paid by many of those closest to her, her friendship with President Reagan and her shared vision for a world free from the Cold War made Britain once again a world leader. The threat of nuclear war, which seemed to hang over us in the early 80s, was lifted. And it was indeed an Iron Lady who helped draw back the Iron Curtain from Eastern Europe, extending freedom to millions. In those countries, too, she will always be remembered. These are mighty achievements, and she was an extraordinary leader of her party, of this country, and of the world during what were extraordinary times. Now, it's true that great leaders are not always easy people. I think it's fair to say that patience was not a virtue Mrs. Thatcher had in abundance. And she didn't always instantly get the point. The great Ronnie Miller, who helped with her speeches for many years, told me the lovely story of the occasion when he was trying to reassure a rather nervous Margaret Thatcher with some soothing words just before she was about to speak at her first party conference as Prime Minister. "Piece of cake, Prime Minister." "No, not now, thank you, dear." And those who knew her best all testify to the warm side of her character, the countless personal kindnesses, the loyalty, the small, thoughtful acts. For someone who so defined a decade, it was perhaps not such a surprise that a new decade ushered in change, and after 11 and a half years, the longest-serving 20th century Prime Minister resigned, and a little over 18 months later, she joined your Lordship's house. Typical, perhaps, of Mrs. T, now as Lady T, that she began with a maiden speech on Europe, on Maastricht, in fact. And typical also that she began by reminding her new home of one or two home truths. "Mine is a somewhat delicate position," she began. "I calculate that I was responsible as Prime Minister for proposing the elevation to this House of 214 of its present members. That must surely be considerably more than most of my predecessors, and my father did not know Lloyd George." Sadly, that was to be one of few speeches to which we would be treated in the subsequent decades. The light which had burned so brightly began to dim as she suffered the loss of Dennis and ill health. But though we may not have been blessed with her words, her presence was keenly felt, sustained by her many friends here. Perhaps Margaret Thatcher's greatest strength as Prime Minister was her refusal to accept Britain's decline. In taking that stance, the obstacles she faced were monumental. But her belief in people, in the British people, in their ability to better themselves and for our country to better itself, was paramount. She was a once-in-a-lifetime Prime Minister and one of the most remarkable leaders this country has seen.
My Lords, we are here today in rare circumstances, a recall of both Houses of Parliament for the specific purpose of paying tribute not just to a formidable former Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, but to a distinguished member of your Lordship's House, Baroness Thatcher. But before I proceed to my remarks, my Lords, I want from these benches to express our sympathies to Lady Thatcher's family. Even when someone has been unwell for some time, as Lady Thatcher has been, to lose someone is still a grievous blow, made in some ways better, but in some ways worse, by the fact that the person in question was so prominent and so public a figure. My Lords, as the tributes to her which have flowed since the news of her death was announced have shown, there is no doubt that Margaret Thatcher was, and will remain, a polarizing figure. For some, including many on the benches opposite, Lady Thatcher inspired then, and inspires now, a devotion to a politician who they believe not only, as the Prime Minister said on Monday, saved this country, but who was the political ideal to which they aspire, and indeed is the political model that they believe that they still need now. From that viewpoint, not only was she the dominant politician of her generation, but she was one of the most influential Prime Ministers this country has ever seen, someone who has claimed, as David Cameron said in his tribute to her, to be Britain's greatest ever peacetime Prime Minister. Not all those on the benches opposite my Lords share that view, Some, like the noble lords, Lord Howe of Aberavon, Lord Lawson of Blaby, Lord Heseltine, and many other noble lords, are part of her story, but in very different ways. Not all of them, my lords, were always at all times in full agreement with her. For some, including on my benches and in my part of the political spectrum, Mrs. Thatcher, as she was then, was someone who was a divisive figure, someone to whom they were and remain fundamentally opposed. Someone whose very name, even now, more than 30 years since she became Britain's Prime Minister in 1979, can raise heights of emotion, of passion, of anger, of despair, and more. Someone who they believe can never be forgiven for what she did to individuals, to communities, to industries, and to the country. That is a legitimate position of disagreement to hold. But to hold parties to celebrate the death of someone is wrong and in bad taste, and something that I deplore. But as the tributes have shown, disagreements with Mrs. Thatcher, her vision, her ideals, her politics and her policies have not prevented even her political opponents from being able to assess fully the enormity of her impact as the United Kingdom's longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century, and as this country's first, and so far still, only woman Prime Minister. My lords, I pay particular tribute to Baroness Thatcher in that role. She was unquestionably a truly remarkable woman, and although I did not agree with many of her policies, I recognise that it was extraordinary for a woman, a grocer's daughter, a wife and a mother, to be a successful research chemist before becoming a barrister, and then going on to become an MP, a minister, and then to lead the Conservative Party, and to become the first female Prime Minister, especially at the time when she did it. Baroness Thatcher was a model for many women, including many women in politics. She burst through the glass ceiling and proved that it could be done, but she did not hold out her helping hand for others to follow. I admire strong women, and she was certainly strong, and she wielded immense power over colleagues as well as the country. But as with my late and noble friend Baroness Castle, for whom I worked in the first 6 years of Baroness Thatcher's premiership, she also knew how to use her womanly wiles. Barbara said that her power over male colleagues derived from the fact that she had, and I quote, a brain as good as a man and the arts of femininity. Personally, though, in relation to the issue of women, I wish Baroness Thatcher has used her strength in different ways. I know that she showed many kindnesses to female colleagues, both MPs and to her staff. But despite the many talented Conservative women in Parliament, they were never, apart from one of another former member of your Lordship's House, Baroness Young, they were never promoted to the Cabinet. Since 1929, when Margaret Bonfield joined the Cabinet, there have still only been 33 women Cabinet members. And as the first ever female Prime Minister, Lady Thatcher could have done so much more for female politicians, but also for working mothers and for women struggling to hold their families and communities together. But she chose not to do so. But there is some in what Lady Thatcher was and did which I do admire. Her personal strength and her courage, shown so bravely in her response to being bombed at the Grand Hotel in Brighton in 1984. Her early support, for example, for Mikhail Gorbachev, with whom I had the good fortune to celebrate his 80th birthday here in this house 2 years ago, and for glasnost and perestroika in the former Soviet Union, because this was important in changing the dynamics of our continent and helping to bring the Cold War to an end, as was the part that she played in driving forward the single market. Her determination and her belief were the principal drivers in Britain regaining the Falklands, but they led as well to misjudgments such as Section 28, now rightly repudiated by today's Conservative Party, or such as gauging the ANC wrong in South Africa, and her legacy and impact in and about Europe is still absolutely with us today. I know too from my own personal experience just how formidable a political opponent she was. In the 1980s, I was then proudly working for my noble friend, the now Lord Kinnock, then leader of the Labour Party, and I saw at first hand, to the cost of our own campaigns, just how effective a politician she was, and indeed how much parts of the country at that time supported her. She had a real appreciation of Middle England's hunger for aspiration, giving people a greater chance to own their own homes. She recognised that our economy needed to change, but the painful changes that were made were not carried by the broadest shoulders and have left an unbalanced economy with which we are still grappling. History will form a judgment on the legacy of Baroness Thatcher as a political figure in Britain and in the world. Agree or disagree with her, she was unquestionably a towering figure in this country and beyond our shores. I leave those judgments to others better qualified than me to make them. But I would like to conclude my remarks by saying something about Lady Thatcher as a member of your Lordship's House. She entered this House in 1992, more than 20 years ago now, and was automatically and rightly immediately a senior figure in this place. When I first came to your Lordship's House, I was mesmerised by this frail but still powerful woman who through sheer determination had transformed our society, dividing opinion and dividing the country. Not for her the consensual notion of one nation that I passionately espouse, but increasingly frail as she became as a result of that enormous impact, her appearances in the House at key moments and on key divisions were electrifying. In more recent years, of course, her appearances were fewer, and I would like to pay tribute here to those who were of particular assistance to her, and I would especially like to mark the support, the real caring support given to her by the noble Lord Forsyth of Drumlene in her later years. Her presence was never anything but controversial, and the debate on what she did and the legacy she left will continue. She was willing, indeed keen, to take on the established orthodoxies, but seemed at times not to understand the devastating impact of her policies on too many communities. She was a polarizing figure, but whether you agreed with her or not, she was a giant in politics, and both regardless of her controversy and precisely because of it, it is as that she will and should be remembered.
My Lords, I will start by following on what the Leader of the House and the Leader of the Opposition have said in associating these benches with condolences to Mrs. Baroness Thatcher's immediate family. And I'll also tie in with something the Leader said, a personal reminiscence. By some reason of serendipity, for about 5 years at the state opening of Parliament, I found myself sitting on that bench there next to Mrs. Thatcher and spending time with her before we awaited the Queen's arrival. And the one thing I want to share with the House was in the year her husband died, and when she had already had a number of minor strokes, and she didn't speak a great deal, but suddenly she turned to me and she said, "My husband died earlier this year." And I said, "Yes, I know Baroness Thatcher." And she paused again and then she said, "I miss him very much." And I think that was something that is remembered today, that tremendous partnership between Baroness Thatcher and her husband, which was so much a factor in her own political life. My Lords, there are times when all the grandeur of the surroundings of this House, we have to play second fiddle to the activities down the corridor. Today, however, although the tributes will no doubt be eloquent and apposite in the other place, it's here in this chamber, as the Leader of the House has reminded us, that we will hear the memories and judgments of those who experienced firsthand the Thatcher phenomenon. If one looks around and considers the number of people that she sacked, promoted, defeated or berated, this must make up a goodly number of those present in the House today. In short, my Lords, the importance of the next couple of hours is that not only does this House know where the bodies are buried, some of the bodies are present here tonight. In January 1965, when paying tribute to the life of Sir Winston Churchill, Harold Wilson referred to the sullen feet of the marching men in Tonypandy, a reminder that Churchill in a long life had sometimes been at the heart of bitter social conflict, as well as showing at other times great leadership in times of national crisis. So it is with Margaret Thatcher, and that reality was reflected in the remarks by Baroness Royal. But to again quote Harold Wilson in his tribute to Churchill, the tempestuous years are over, and the years of appraisal are yet to come. I will not attempt such an appraisal today. Instead, let me rely on two perspectives given not at the time of her death, but some years ago. 7 years ago, the New Statesman invited its readers to nominate the hero of our times. Somewhat to the surprise and embarrassment of the New Statesman, Baroness Thatcher was the highest rated British politician. The paper explained this result by the fact that no one was in any doubt about what Mrs. Thatcher stood for and what she believed in. And it was those qualities of steadfastness and clarity of purpose which had been recognised by the New Statesman readers. My second assessment comes from another surprising source. As a member of the other place in 1982, I was present for 2 exchanges which took place between Enoch Powell and Mrs. Thatcher. To fully appreciate the quotes I'm about to give, you will have to imagine that slightly nasal black country twang in which Mr. Powell spoke, but which I will not try and imitate. First, Enoch Powell to Mrs. Thatcher after the Falkland Islands had been invaded, speaking on the 3rd of April in the House of Commons. He said, "The Prime Minister, shortly after she came to office, received a sobriquet as the Iron Lady. It arose in the context of remarks which she made about defence against the Soviet Union and its allies. But there was no reason to suppose that the Right Honourable Lady did not welcome and indeed take pride in that description. In the next few weeks, this House, the nation, and the Right Honourable Lady herself will learn what metal she's made of." My second quote comes some 10 weeks later, on the 17th of June 1982, after the British victory in the Falklands War. And Enoch Powell said, "Is the Right Honourable Lady aware that the report has now been received from the public analyst of a certain substance recently subject to analysis, and that I have obtained a copy of that report? It shows that the substance under test consisted of ferrous matter of the highest quality, that it is of exceptional tensile strength, is highly resistant to wear and tear and to stress, and may be used with advantage for all national purposes." I think that was the only time in my experience of Enoch Powell actually making a joke. My Lords, there's no need to airbrush out of history or to ignore the fact that most of us on these benches spent a good deal of our political lives fiercely opposing many aspects of what became known as Thatcherism. But that does not prevent us from recognising those qualities which were highlighted both by the New Statesman and by Enoch Powell. Qualities which have quite rightly brought us together today to pay due respect and proper tribute to Margaret Thatcher as a figure of enduring importance in our national life.
My Lords, I rise in tribute to the noble lady Baroness Thatcher, sharing with noble lords a string of strong memories of a remarkable woman, the first to occupy the office of Prime Minister. As others have said, the change that she made in the face of Britain was complete. It opened up new avenues of possibility in all directions: share ownership, home ownership, liberalisation of the markets, entrepreneurial innovation, and so on. She strengthened Britain's role in the world immeasurably with her clear policies on defence, the Falklands, Northern Ireland, communism, Europe, South Africa, and more. No one was in any doubt there was a force in the land. I spent the last years of the 1980s in County Durham, so I know some of the deep divisions that Lady Thatcher's policies caused. Billy Elliot country was not an all-singing, all-dancing landscape. It's almost impossible to find moderate opinion for or against on her style of leadership. But the one thing we can all acknowledge is that she was a leader of absolute integrity in terms of her own beliefs. She was an iconic conviction politician. The Church of England had its moments with Lady Thatcher, of course. The suggestion that the date for the enthronement of the Archbishop of Canterbury be moved so that it avoided a clash with the budget of 1980 was one early instance. Happily, and in that occasion, the lady was for turning. In the end, it was the budget that was rescheduled. The Church traditionally has a role, as we know, of critical solidarity with governments of all persuasions. And so the production of the influential report, Faith in the City, and the Archbishop of Canterbury's Falkland sermon, in which he remembered the bereaved on both sides of the conflict, these both caused momentary mayhem in the press. But that was to be expected when issues of principle were at stake. It didn't dent her respect for the Church or our regard for her steely qualities. It was entirely fitting that the place where she particularly enjoyed the chance to walk securely and privately in her latter years were the grounds of Lambeth Palace, which successive archbishops placed at her disposal. We should remember too her roots in Methodism and the influence that the Christian faith played in informing her beliefs about personal responsibility and the importance of religion in public life. Methodism was born in the pursuit of justice and hope amongst working people. It had and still has a radical edge, and it's from that edge that Margaret Thatcher drew much of her strength. You don't have to agree with every decision she took to acknowledge the strength of her character, the determination, the passion in all she did. History will, as we have said, continue to debate the legacy of Baroness Thatcher for years to come, but she clearly defined politics, not just for her generation, but for many generations. Some of us perhaps wish that on a few more occasions the lady had been for Turning has a good pedigree in Christian theology, but we can still applaud her many achievements while regretting some of the excesses, and we most certainly will not forget her. May she rest in peace.
My Lords, on behalf of the Crossbench Group, may I also associate myself with the very thoughtful tributes already made to the late Baroness Thatcher and add my deepest condolences to her family. My Lords, it is perhaps understandable that on an occasion such as this, we draw on personal experiences, although I must say that I have nothing like the depth of experience of some of my colleagues who worked with Mrs. Thatcher day by day. But I first met Mrs. Thatcher in the mid-70s, when she was the after-dinner speaker at the annual conference of the Association of Directors of Social Services. The House will not be surprised to learn that she made a characteristically challenging speech, leaving the audience in no doubt that given the opportunity, she had a real ambition to change local government and in particular the social care services. At the end of the event, the president of the association told her that he'd arranged, quote, a good malt to be delivered to his room, and he hoped that she and others would join, a few others, would join him for a brief nightcap. I have no doubt that part of his motivation was to, as it were, put her right on a few things that she had said. What, however, he did not expect was that in the early hours of the morning, when they were all flagging, Mrs. Thatcher was driving on in full flow, setting out the important issues that she intended to tackle. Now, my Lords, I feel sure that he, as he was a he, was not the first to regret even the hint of attempting to patronize her, nor was he the last to experience her phenomenal energy, drive, conviction, and steely determination. My Lords, almost a decade later, as Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher commissioned Sir Roy Griffiths, who was then the Deputy Chairman and Managing Director of Sainsbury's, to conduct a major review of the social care services for vulnerable adults. The Baroness Pitkeithley and I greatly enjoyed working with Sir Roy, and as we were given the opportunity to be called his advisors. I was with Sir Roy on the day that he was to meet the Prime Minister to go through with her the main thrust of his report. He was a wise man and had learnt the importance of careful preparation and to face what was likely to be a forensic scrutiny. Afterwards he told me that all had gone well, primarily because he concentrated on the main thrust of his report. In a nutshell, this was simply that when a vulnerable person is dependent upon a relative stranger to meet their personal needs, their primary concern is about the quality and sensitivity of the service that is delivered, and not the nature of the organisation that delivers that service. I feel sure that this way of thinking hugely pleased Mrs. Thatcher, not least because at that time the local authorities operated an almost total monopoly of the home care services, the day centre services, the residential homes, and for all people, whatever their disabilities or special needs. In addition to that, they also regulated the few independent providers that were then operating in their area. This was the beginning of a fundamental transformation of these services that are of such importance to the well-being of our fellow citizens. My Lords, in addition, I need hardly remind the House that for very good reason we have often had cause to praise the Children Act of 1989. That bedrock piece of legislation changed the childcare practices in this country. And now, almost 25 years on, it has stood the test of time. So, my Lords, in short, during the years that Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister, the foundations were laid for huge changes in every aspect of the social care services in this country. Now, inevitably, many of these changes were and are contested. But one thing that was never in doubt was the determination of the Prime Minister to see them through. My Lord, the record of Baroness Thatcher as a woman in a male-dominated environment, as a tenacious politician, and as a formidable Prime Minister is for all to see, and it will certainly endure. May she rest in peace.
Lords, my Lords, I rise to speak as one of the dwindling band of members who appeared on the 1979 photograph of the Cabinet. And I speak also, I suppose, as a member of an even smaller band of those who were members of her shadow cabinet in prior years. And those of us who are left share with so many more the sadness and the affection that we feel at this time. Now, my Lords, much has been said over the last few days about Margaret Thatcher. Much of it has been said several times, but let me just add two or three of my own memories. I remember Margaret Thatcher above all as a particularly kind woman. I give one example. In the first Christmas that she was Prime Minister in 1979, she said to me, "Do you know of any of our people in the House of Commons who are going to be alone through death or divorce or whatever over this Christmas period? Because if you do, I would like to ask them to check us to come and stay over Christmas." And that, I thought at the time, was one of the most generous things from somebody with all the pressures of a Prime Minister. My Lords, there are some who say that she was a very bad listener. I would argue very strongly with that. Maybe she wasn't a very good listener when some of her colleagues were embarking on what I call waffle. But she, so often I heard a meeting of ministers when Secretary of State had to come and propose a new policy. she would begin the discussion in her typically strident way of saying, well, Secretary of State, I'm not very attracted to what you wanted to do, but let's hear it if you must. He would then explain what he wanted to do, and others would come in. And having listened, she would say, well, Secretary of State, if that's what you want to do, well, you better go on and do it, but if it all goes pear-shaped, don't come back to me to bail you out. Of course, Margaret Thatcher loved, probably above all, an informed political debate. I have a memory of a very small lunch in Downing Street when Pierre Trudeau came over from Canada to complain because we were not speeding as much as he would have liked the legislation to release British control over the Canadian Constitution. At lunch we quickly got that out of the way. And then Margaret Thatcher and Pierre Trudeau, who clearly disliked each other, embarked on what I call a gloves-off confrontation of political philosophies. Francis Pym and I were the only outsiders present, and I must say it was a memorable experience to be a fly on the wall and listen to those two going hammer and tongs together. My Lords, the one word I suppose that so many will think of with regard to Margaret Thatcher was the word leadership. There are so many of the people today who look back on Margaret Thatcher's period with enmity, who were not alive at the time when she was Prime Minister. This myth has grown, which has led to the contentious attitude of some people today. They forget that in 1979 Britain was on its knees. It needed what needed doing, had been needed doing for decades, and she set out to do those things. She changed Britain. She changed much of what went on in the world, and she played a major part in bringing down what Ronald Reagan described as the evil empire of the Soviet Union. And my final comment is that I find it hardly surprising that the hostility one hears from some people today, I don't believe she would feel at all surprised at that hostility, bearing in mind what she had to do and the fundamental changes she needed to bring about.
My Lords, I have hesitated to venture to add to the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of words which have been spoken and written about the noble Lady Baroness Thatcher these last 3 days. But perhaps something should be said from the perspective of one who, as a civil servant and as Secretary of the Cabinet, worked closely for her and with her for 8 of the 11.5 years for which she was Prime Minister. Statistically speaking, the turnover of Prime Minister has been higher than that of Cabinet Secretaries. More Cabinet Secretaries have served more than one Prime Minister. Most Cabinet Secretaries have served more than one Prime Minister, and sometimes 3, like my noble friend, the noble Lord Butler of Brockwell, or even 4, like Lord Hunter Tanworth, my predecessor. So I am a relatively rare bird in that I have served only one Prime Minister. I was summoned one morning in July 1979 to a meeting with the Prime Minister at number 10, which I hoped but didn't know was going to result in an appointment as Secretary of the Cabinet. And I was taken upstairs to her room and was shown in at the door of her study. And as I went through the door, she looked up at me and she said, "Robert, you're looking very tired." It wasn't the most promising opening to an interview in which I was hoping to be offered one of the most onerous jobs in the public service. So I stammered out something about having been up rather late the previous night. And then she said, Robert, I've asked you to come in order that I can tell you that I would want to appoint you as Cabinet Secretary to succeed John Hunt in October. And of course, I was delighted and accepted the offer. I went downstairs and I told the Private Secretary that the Prime Minister had offered me the job and I'd accepted it. But it was a little bit odd, I said. She started by saying, Robert, you look very tired. And the Private Secretary said, oh, don't worry about that. She's saying that to everybody this morning. The noble lady, the Baroness Royal, spoke about her lack of aspiration to be a feminist, if I may sum it up in that way. That may have been fair, but she was nothing if not feminine. And many of her colleagues and many of those who were her civil servants will recognize that. My recollection goes back to the first visit we had from President Mitterrand of France in 1981 to Downing Street, and we were all dreading it because he had no English, or claimed to have no English, so that everything had to be interpreted. And of course, he was French. She greatly disliked his predecessor, and he was said to be a socialist. But the meetings went rather well. They went, despite the interpretation, they went smoothly. There was good speeches by both parties at a dinner. And when the President finally came to leave the next afternoon, I went with the Prime Minister to see him off at the front door of 10 Downing Street. And as we walked back, I said to the Prime Minister, well, in a tone, I suppose, of some surprise, that visit went rather well, didn't it, Prime Minister? And she said, yes, I suppose it did. Then there was a pause, and she said, of course, he likes women, you know. And then looking back, I recognized that the President had been, how shall I put it, flattering her femininity throughout the meeting, and that she recognized it and enjoyed every minute of it. More than once, during the time I was with her, she told me that her role as Prime Minister was to be the guardian of the strategy. She had a clear vision of what that strategy should be and of the policies that were required to carry it out. She displayed great courage and determination in pursuing the strategy and introducing and sustaining the policies which it required. And she could exercise great firmness and all the strength of her personality in making sure of the active support of her colleagues and her civil servants in putting the policies into effect. She respected the civil service as an institution and indeed valued the traditional virtues of integrity and impartiality. She liked and respected many, but not all, of the individual civil servants she had to deal with. And she went out of her way to be considerate and kind to those who worked in her office. But I think she thought that civil servants in general were too set in their ways and had become too accustomed to the management of decline. In discussing appointments with her, she never once asked, is he one of us? She wanted to know whether someone was a doer as well as a thinker, and whether he or she had what it took, not just to advise cleverly on policy, but also to manage a department or division effectively. As many have remarked, she expected her colleagues and those who worked with her to work very hard, and she set us all an example in that respect. She was a glutton for work and took an infinity of trouble to master the detail of every subject she was called upon to consider. often to the discomfiture of those with whom she was going to discuss it. That was all made easier for her, and more challenging for the rest of us, by her capacity to manage on 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night, not just for a night or two, but seemingly indefinitely. For her, the working day was 2 or 3 hours longer than it was for any of the rest of us, weaker vessels. And there was no catnapping during the day. There were times when it seemed like a very unfair advantage. She kept up the pace throughout my time, though I believe that there were some slight signs of weakening towards the end of her time in office. One of my duties was to advise her on issues about the organisation of the machinery of government. I don't think she was ever much interested in those issues. She thought that they were of secondary importance. What mattered to her was having the right policy and having the right person in place to put the policies into effect. Tinkering with organisations diverted energy from what really mattered and was a waste of time and energy and money. As has been said, she was a conviction politician with skill and determination in expressing her convictions. But she was also, as I very often saw, a shrewd, cautious and pragmatic political operator in government, adept at adopting and presenting pragmatic outcomes in a framework of principled conviction. In 1982, the government committed itself to a policy of rolling devolution in Northern Ireland. The policy made little progress, and after the election of June 1983, the Prime Minister decided, or was persuaded, to explore the possibility of an agreement with the government of the Republic of Ireland, which might give that government, as a surrogate for the minority community in Northern Ireland, the opportunity to have a say in aspects of governance in Northern Ireland, without compromising, and this was very important for Mrs. Thatcher, Lady Thatcher, without compromising the sovereignty of the United Kingdom government in Northern Ireland. After nearly 2 years of negotiation, closely supervised and negotiated by the Prime Minister and her colleagues, as the noble Lord Howe will remember, and the noble Lord Hurd, we achieved a draft agreement. The draft was never going to set the Thames on fire, or the Liffey for that matter, and it could not be expected to go down well with the Unionist community in Northern Ireland. It cannot be claimed that Mrs. Thatcher was enthusiastic about it even at the time, but she clearly preferred an outcome which she could proclaim as a success and which would certainly be welcomed in Washington to a breakdown of the negotiation and a failure of the policy that it expressed and represented. So she signed the agreement, and so long as she remained Prime Minister, she unwaveringly defended and adhered to it. After her retirement, she was apt to say that she wished it had not been made. I believe myself that she was mistaken in that. Unlike the noble Lord Trimble, I think that the agreement, which has certainly been of lasting benefit to relations with the Irish Republic, has been one of the foundations for the subsequent developments in Northern Ireland affairs brought about by Sir John Major and Mr. Blair. My Lords, this is not the time or the place for reminiscing about the good and not so good times during the years when I was working with Lady Thatcher. But I am glad to have this opportunity of putting on record not only my sadness at her passing and my condolences with her family, which we all share, but also my gratitude for her unwavering confidence and support, for her many kindnesses during those years, and my respect and admiration for her qualities and achievements as Prime Minister, and my lasting affection for her as a friend.
I'm grateful to you, my noble friend. My Lords, in order to understand the true greatness of Margaret Thatcher, it's necessary to remember the state of our country and our continent in 1979 when she became Prime Minister. Our country was in decline, a decline many thought permanent and some thought terminal. I remember listening, I think it was in 1978, to one of the great gurus of the time. He saw no answer to our predicament. He said, after the next election, we shall either have a government that doesn't try to do the things that are necessary, in which case failure will inevitably continue, decline will inevitably continue, or we will have a government that tries to do the things that are necessary, but it will become so unpopular that it will be bound to lose the election after next. Margaret Thatcher proved him wrong, and in doing so, as the Prime Minister has said, she saved our country. It's been said this afternoon, it's been said many times, that she was a divisive figure. She was. She had to be. There was no consensus about the right thing to do for our country. And if she'd waited for consensus, nothing would ever have happened. She saw what needed to be done, and she did it with clarity, with courage, and with conviction. It's also true that her divisiveness on occasion extended to members of her own administration. There was one occasion when a minister sent a paper to her which she rejected. He had the temerity to send it back with the words, "Prime Minister, this is government policy." She replied, "It may be government policy, but I don't agree with a word of it." 1979, as we all know, Europe was divided in two, and the eastern half was subjugated to the yoke of communist tyranny. The part that Margaret Thatcher played in partnership with Ronald Reagan in freeing those countries has been well documented. But there's one aspect of the story which is less well known. In 1990, as her employment secretary, I went to Poland. My noble friend Lord Fowler, my predecessor, had set up something called the Know-How Fund to help establish small businesses in those newly free countries. My opposite number was a man called Jacek Kuron, who had been imprisoned for his opposition to communism. But he took me to see Marshal Jaruzelski, the man whose regime had imprisoned him. And Marshal Jaruzelski told me about the part Margaret Thatcher had played in the rise of solidarity. He said she visited Poland during one of Solidarity's strikes in the shipyards of Gdansk. And she said to me, "You know, this isn't an ordinary strike, and you ought to talk to its leaders." Until then, he told me, I'd had no more intention of talking to them than I'd had of flying to the moon. But she persuaded me. So I began to talk to Lech Walesa. And you know what happened after that. My lords, all of us who have stood for elective office have hoped to make a difference. That's become rather a cliche, but like most cliches, it's true. There are very, very few people who have made a difference on the scale which Margaret Thatcher achieved. She saved our country. She helped bring freedom to half our continent. The light of her legacy will shine as a beacon down the generations.
My lords, it's a privilege to follow my honourable friend, and I must say I wholly agree with his final conclusion. We all of us, as the leader said when he started, have our own personal anecdotes, remembrances about Margaret Thatcher, those of us whose paths crossed with hers. I have two. One is in a life which I suppose has had some small excitements. I can tell you that nothing I have ever experienced so terrorized me as having to stand up as a young, inexperienced, wet behind the ears leader of my party and question her in the House of Commons in the other place when she was at the full plenitude of her powers, with the inevitable result that I would be ritually handbagged twice a week in front of the microphones of the nation. Thank God there wasn't television in the chamber then. My second remembrance illustrates the point, I think, made first by the Leader of the House, one of her, I think, best qualities, and one of her most formidable weapons. My wife and I had been invited to one of those Downing Street events marking the visit of some foreign leader. I honestly cannot remember exactly who it was. Afterwards, as we were coming down the stairs of number 10, we met the Prime Minister coming up. My wife, who I should explain is much more rampantly left-wing than I am, hated her policies with a passion. The Prime Minister stopped and talked to us for a few moments. And as she moved away, my wife hissed through gritted teeth, "She's absolutely bloody charming, damn it." And so she was, to everyone, except of those, of course, who happened to be in her cabinet, as this row of wholly unextinct volcanoes sitting in front of me will no doubt attest. This was only one of her many paradoxes, for she was, and it was a point being made by Lord Armstrong, in reality not at all the straightforward, black and white, no-nonsense, unbending warrior leader that she latterly liked to portray. She knew, at least until the very end, when to compromise, and did so, perhaps most significantly when, though relishing her anti-Europeanism, she nevertheless signed Britain up for the single European market. Three qualities, in my view, set her apart as something different, but each of them had their drawbacks and their downside. The first was a passionate commitment to freedom. As a liberal, needless to say, I mostly welcomed that, though perhaps not as much as I should have done at the time. In Bosnia, later, when I tried to get a stagnant economy moving, I found myself putting into practice many of the very things that I had opposed when she introduced them. Aggressive liberalization of the markets, stripping down the barriers to business, lowering taxation. In these things, she was right at the time. Even if today we find that taken to excess, some of these attributes have not led to greater prosperity for all, but to near ruin and a disgusting climate of greed for the few. In this, my lords, I suspect that the revolution she started has perhaps somewhat run its course. Our challenge today is to find a kinder, less destructive, more balanced way of shaping our economy. But that's today. At the time that she did those things, they needed to be done. But her belief in freedom was, perhaps one might say, strangely partial. She did much to enhance individual economic freedom, and our country was much the better for it. But she did far less to enhance the political freedoms of, for instance, the gay community, or the people of Scotland, or perhaps most markedly and paradoxically, and this has been commented on too, for the standing of women in society. She was, and arguably given the context of the time, this was one of her very greatest achievements, Britain's first woman Prime Minister. But her influence and power came not from the exercise of the female principle in politics, but from the fact that she was far better than any man at the male ones. Her second defining quality was her patriotism. David Cameron, the present Prime Minister, recently called her the Patriot Prime Minister. It's a good phrase, and an apposite one. But her patriotism too, though so powerfully held and expressed, was more about the preservation and restoration of Britain's past position than it was about, it seems to me, preparing us for the challenges of what came next. She used her formidable talents to give our country a few more years of glory, and for that we should be eternally grateful. But that legacy means that Britain today still finds itself uncomfortable and undecided about its true position in the world, not least in relation to Europe, where the infection that she planted still has the capacity to rip apart her party. There can be no doubt that she restored our country's position in the world. There can be no doubt of that. But perhaps in a way which makes us today even less able to answer Dean Acheson's famous challenge that having lost an empire, we have yet to find a role. My Lords, her final triumphant quality was, of course, her courage. And this, I think, is the preeminent quality of leadership. And she had it in abundance. Yet this, too, her greatest asset, had its dangers. I used to have a principle in distant, more robust days that I would never take anyone on operations who was not at least as frightened as I was. But she was frightened of nothing. She could see the risks, but she ignored them if she believed she was right. And paradoxically, this in the final analysis was what ended her long time as a Prime Minister. Is it not always hubris that gets us in the end? Complex, extraordinary, magnificent, fallible, flawed, infuriating. One thing, however, is certain and cannot be denied, except by those so sunk in bitterness that they will not see. She won great victories for what she stood for at home and huge respect for our country abroad. If politics is defined, and I think it can be, by principles, the courage to hold to them, the ability to drive them through to success, then she was, without a doubt, the commanding politician and the greatest Prime Minister of our age.
Among the many tributes that Baroness Thatcher received in her lifetime, she especially valued her election as an honorary fellow of the Royal Society. And I think she would be very cross if this was not mentioned on this occasion. Lady Thatcher was, of course, a science graduate from Oxford, studying under and doing research with the Nobel laureate Dorothy Hodgkin. And at the Royal Society event celebrating her election, with uncharacteristic self-deprecation, she observed that this validated her career choice because she doubted whether she would have been elected a Fellow of the Royal Society for her research in chemistry. Over the past 2 centuries, the Royal Society has elected very few Prime Ministers as honorary Fellows, but Lady Thatcher richly deserved this recognition for the way she promoted and enlarged the voice of science and science advice in government. I mean, it is easy to forget that in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the huge importance of having good science and having the voice of science right there influencing the cabinet, that memory from World War II, the presence in the cabinet office of a first-rate scientist as chief scientific advisor, distinguished and effective people, that had declined, so that in the 70s the chief scientific advisor had declined to be an informal 1 or 2 day a week meeting with the policy unit in the cabinet office. Lady Thatcher turned that around. She appointed a very distinguished scientist and industrialist, someone from Pilkington Glass, Sir Robin Nicholson, and she reversed that trend. She also valued and indeed established ACOS, the Advisory Council on Science and Technology, and she frequently chaired it, which no subsequent Prime Minister has done. In summary, we all know what a remarkable woman Lady Thatcher was. But I think we need to more commonly include and recognise her interest in science and commitment to it as one of her remarkabilities, if I may coin a word. and it certainly should be so recognised.
My Lords, I take my mind back to before I was elected to the House of Commons, when I spent a great deal of time abroad. And like so many of us at that time, was constantly embarrassed at the sympathy which was offered to me by foreigners for the state to which Great Britain had descended. A few years later, again I was spending a lot of time abroad as the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry. The change could not have been greater. The admiration that was expressed for what had been done in this country. Sometimes it was, I thought, slightly over the top. I could never quite get my mind round the remark made to me in Italy. If only we had a Thatcher here. Can one imagine the concept of an Italian Margaret Thatcher? Robert Armstrong, the noble Lord Armstrong would have had some problems then indeed, I fancy. Well, I think also we should come to some kind of consensus here today that there were two quite remarkable prime ministers of post-war Great Britain. Two prime ministers who actually changed the country and changed it in the way that they wanted to change it. They didn't sit as change happened round about them. They were Clement Attlee and Margaret Thatcher. And we have accommodated ourselves to many of the things which Clement Attlee did, although many of us at the time would have opposed them. Even some of those in his party, of course, who opposed his policy on British membership of NATO and possession of nuclear weapons, for example. And we on our side for much of what he did in the social services area. We should also recollect that when she came into office, in '79, somewhat, I think, against the odds that would have been offered a year or so earlier, because of the winter of discontent. The trades union generals had brought down Ted Heath's government. They brought down Jim Callaghan's government. And they brought into office noble lady Thatcher's government. They expected, particularly Master Scargill, to bring down her government too. What would have become of our democracy had they succeeded? And how many potential prime ministers were there who could have defeated them and preserved our democracy? And how many of those who saw her in her early days as Prime Minister would have dreamt that in partnership with Ronald Reagan, she would have precipitated the end of the Cold War, the bringing down of the Berlin Wall? And it was she, of course, who observed that Prague was not in Eastern Europe, but that Prague is at the centre of Europe. A geographical fact. One of my regrets is that her successors did not sufficiently exploit what she had done. And we have left those other Europeans, the Russians, still rather outside the European family and compact. There's much to be done still. She has often said, of course, and we've heard it today, that she was divisive. But there were two great influences in her life. One was her scientific training, and I'm particularly glad that the noble Lord May mentioned that aspect of her life. And the other, of course, was her religious beliefs. If I may observe so to noble bishops, there is a precedent for being divisive. There are sheep and there are goats. The noble lady was aware from both her scientific training and her religious beliefs that there are things which are right and there are things which are wrong, both technically, scientifically, and morally. She pursued that which she believed to be right. And I must say that as her party chairman, I found my life was made much easier by my understanding of the certainties of her beliefs. I was never asked by her to commission a focus group. Had I been so, I would have resisted manfully. What is more, if I woke in the morning on the radio and heard the BBC's version of the news of the day, I would know what her reaction would be to the news because of the certainty of the construct of her beliefs. It made life very much easier for me. And I should also like to say how grateful I will always be for the fact that she gave me the opportunity to serve in high office, the country which she and I believe all of us here, love. And I'm grateful to her too for that other side of her character, of the support which she gave to my wife and to myself after we were injured. No doubt somebody in this house will correct me, but I cannot think of a precedent for a Secretary of State remaining in office as Secretary of State, although absent from the Cabinet for over 3 months. She allowed me to run my office from my hospital bed. Admittedly, I had the support of 2 splendid civil servants particularly who ran my private office, both of whom have appeared again in other roles. Mr. Callum McCarthy and of course another fellow, I think he's achieved high office somewhere more recently, the Secretary of State for Health not long ago. Quality people. But it was she who backed me and allowed me to continue. Of course I did not always agree with her, because I have some rather strong convictions and views too. And I recollect one occasion when I left her office in number 10, walked back over to Victoria Street, got into my office and asked my private secretary if there had been any calls from number 10. No, Secretary of State, he said. So I knew then that I was still the Secretary of State whilst I was walking back. And she, of course, was brought down in the end, not by the electorate, but her colleagues. Not only is it quite remarkable that she won 3 elections running, someone else has done that since. What was remarkable is that she polled slightly more votes on the occasion of her 3rd victory, when she had been in office for 8 years, than on her 1st. That I regard as a triumph for her. My regrets I think I do regret that because of the commitments I had made to my own wife, that I did not feel able either to continue in government after 1987 or to return to government when she later asked me to do. And I left her, I fear, at the mercy of her friends. That I do regret.
If I could intervene briefly, because I was elected in May 1979, and at the time that Lord Joplin was referring to the first photograph of the first Margaret Thatcher government, I can tell him that there was a group of about a dozen newly elected MPs, because that's all there were of us, who were deciding whether it would be better for our morale to be photographed as a group or individually. And we decided it was probably better to do it individually, although if I had the wit, I would have asked him if we could borrow the cabinet room to do it in. And in a way, I think that's one of Margaret Thatcher's achievements, was that she forced the Labour Party to reinvent itself. And in a way, following Lord Tebbutt's comments, it's also what Lord Attler, then Clement Attlee, then later Lord Attlee, made the Tory party do after its reputation in the 1930s. And I think both of those people, very different personalities, but had a similarly dramatic effect on changes in the country, and we need to remember that. I then also recall Jim Callaghan saying to me in May 1979 that the people he felt most sorry for were for those of us who'd just been elected, because he said, you'll be in opposition for about 10 years. Well, it was 18 years in opposition, and that was when we forced ourselves to change. And it's a very important impact in British politics, actually, that the system we have does force political parties to change, because if you don't listen to the electorate ignores you, and you pay a very high price for that indeed. I want to just say a few things otherwise. Jim Callaghan also said to me at the time that we had hoped that with North Sea oil we would be able to make some of the changes to the economy that we needed to make. And that really was where he was at. He felt that the economy needed to change, but with the advantage of North Sea oil we could do it. Margaret Thatcher took a different view. She felt, as has been indicated a number of times, that you had to force change on people. I have to say this is where I do part company, and I do think it is a fundamental difference between the two parties, because there are ways of bringing about the changes that were necessary then without some of the conflict that we experienced here. You need only look at what Germany did, particularly with East Germany, to see how change of that type can be brought about differently. And I think that is an important lesson there. But it is a very powerful one. She also had, as the noble Lord Tebbit knows, a strong suspicion, if not dislike, of trade unions, as indeed he and I had times to debate that, I think, on one or two privatisations, as they were. But I think, and I noted Matthew Parris's very good comments, I thought, in the Times yesterday, how she hated the closed shop, and hate was underlined by Margaret Thatcher in her view. I think that is one of the ways in which she actually made some of the negative aspects of the trade unions change. I've never taken the view, and still don't take it, that trade unions aren't a very important defence in a democracy, actually. They are an important right for people. But I also acknowledge what we were blind to in some of the 1980s, that some of the practices within the trade union movement were not only doing us damage, but were actually bad practices and needed to change. And I think that, again, is another message that we ought to emphasise. One of my frustrations about Margaret Thatcher, and when I would question her in the House, was that I sometimes felt she was, this is going to sound terribly patronising, it isn't intended to be, but I would feel she was very much on the right track, but somehow or other she was missing the big opportunity. And I'll give one example of it. It was house price sales. Selling council houses would have been a brilliant policy, in my view, if she'd have done what I think it was the early Conservative housing minister, I think it was Hugh Rossi, if I remember rightly, said if we reinvested all the money from the sales of council houses into building new houses. Margaret Thatcher took the opposite view, and I have to say, if she hadn't, I do think that would have been a truly brilliant policy. As it was the right policy, but not followed through, certainly in the way that I would like. Now, as most people here have been saying, that she followed all her policies through with determination, I'm saying, well, that one I would have liked to push over to the other side of it, so that we could have got the investment in housing that, frankly, would have saved us an awful lot of the problems that we're missing today. I certainly didn't like the language that was used. I do think, and it has to be said this, that the language used, but again about the trade unions, was deeply damaging to the fabric of Britain, particularly in the north and west of Britain. And here, if you talked about the enemy within, I was Shadow Home Office Minister at the time, and I was going mainly to look with what the police were doing in the miners' strike, in the print union strikes, and some of the others. And what troubled me was when that phrase came out, the enemy within, what you had to know that particularly in South Wales, but also elsewhere in the UK, the police officer on facing the picket line was often a relative or close friend of the miner on the other side of the picket line. And that phrase, the enemy within, began to fragment society in a way that I think was deeply, deeply unsatisfactory. In a way, it was her love of an argument, but pushing it through with a compassion and fury of her own, which I think made her enemies, which perhaps needn't have happened. I agree entirely with the comments that were made earlier about the Anglo-Irish agreement, although again, as I think I've said in this House once before, we owe an awful lot to Jim Pryor for that, and actually for his strategic thinking on the need to have the Anglo-Irish agreement. I think that was absolutely right. One of the other things that puzzled me, because fairly soon after I was elected, of course, the Falklands came up, and the quotes that were given about the quotes that were given from Enoch Powell to her were absolutely right, and I heard them. What interested me, and it was taught me a lesson, is that, and it perhaps something the people of Argentina ought to think about, as a result of defeating General Galtieri, the dictatorship in Argentina fell. And although it might not have been the intention in the first instance, it was the outcome. And if the Argentinian people could see that, that might be beneficial. It's a bit more contentious to say it, but it happens to be my belief too, that I think it helped bring about the end of what we all took for granted then of the juntas in South America. One after another, they fell. And one of the messages was that you do need to stand up to dictators. And again, I might regret some of the language that was used, not least in the Sun at the time, because it played on the worst aspects of nationalism. The reality was that standing up to a dictator like that had benefits for the Argentinian people, as well as doing the right thing. The other point I want to make, actually, which is the one that saddens me the most, in a way, is the divisions between the north and south of Britain, and indeed between Wales. I have to say that if the policies in Scotland had been different, the Tory party would still be a significant party in Scotland, and I, for one, as a Labour politician, was often praying for the Tory party to recover in Scotland, because, frankly, if it had not been destroyed, you would not have the SNP where it is today. And that, frankly, is a threat to the Union, which Margaret Thatcher would have been appalled by. But it came about in part because of that position of the opposition to, or the assumption that you could take Scotland for granted. You can't, and the same applies to Wales and other parts of Britain, including the north of England. I think history will judge her well. She was a major political figure by any standard. She argued dramatically and full drama, and she did it with great passion. But in doing so, she also at times sowed the seeds of bitterness. She loved an argument, she loved a challenge, and she loved change. In that way, she was a Tory radical, not a Tory One Nation. And it is an important lesson for us all, in a sense, that you can be a great leader in a democracy. No great leader changes things without hurting people. And I say this simply, not in any criticism of Margaret Thatcher, but simply to say I think we should be careful about going down the road of military involvement in funerals, because there is a danger that you link it to political parties, and I really don't think that is a good road to go down. It will also cause us problems in the future. But in everything else, I would say Margaret Thatcher was an extraordinary performance as a Prime Minister, very influential. It taught me a lot, but it also does have within it, and it's very important that we recognise this, a balance. The people who are doing, in my mind, very foolish things like having parties in the street are totally wrong, but we need to recognise that in a democracy, minorities have to be heard and recognised, that no Prime Minister can govern entirely compassionately. They have to take tough decisions, they have to hurt people, but in doing that you also need to try and get some balance in the community at the end of the day, and that requires compassion as well as conflict.
My lords.
Wait.
My lords, I know we have some marvellous speeches yet to come, and we will benefit from them all. I think the mood is perhaps my noble friend will wake as we're waiting for a while, but I'm certainly keen to hear from Lady Williams after that. I hope others are too.
My lords, I get the mood of the House, and I shall be as brief as I can, and I don't intend to say anything about the great issues of Margaret Thatcher, but I was her chief whip for the whole of her second term in office, and I want to just say one or two little things about what I would call the human and the personal side. I frequently, late at night, used to have a long talk with her about the events of the day, and I'm afraid the things she said at those occasions will go with me to the grave. But I would just wanted to say to anybody who had the slightest doubts about her sense of humour, had only got to be at one of those evenings. She had a very agreeable sense of humour, even if on some public occasions she managed to conceal it, but not. And secondly, I would just, and I feel I really have to do this, to say to my noble friend Lord Tevitt how much I appreciated what he said about the kindnesses that we got after Brighton. It was way beyond the call of duty, the support and the kindnesses we got, to the point where I actually had my wedding reception at number 10 afterwards. I think the first time anybody had been married, number 10, since Lloyd George's daughter when he was Prime Minister. And that was a very special way of rebuilding her life. And my last point I wanted to make has got a degree of topicality about it. I remember when the chairman of the procedure committee in the Commons came to see her and to say he had got a wonderful idea for improving Prime Minister's questions. He had this bright idea that instead of questions being on Tuesday and Thursday, he would suggest they should be on Wednesday for half an hour. And she looked him steelily in the face and she said, "What do you think the House of Commons would like?" And that was the end of it. Things stayed as they were. But she had more more reason than more reason than she admitted. Of course, she knew that every Tuesday and every Thursday she had to be, as she put it, match fit for Prime Minister's questions, and that was a great advantage. But there was a second great advantage, that her whole government knew that on Tuesdays and Thursdays the boss was in the House of Commons defending the government. And my goodness, if there was any department that hadn't sent a note as to what the issues were that were coming up, I used to get the message, and I would be very tactfully ringing some fellow who was towards the end of his political career, but he didn't know it at the time. All I would say about her, because we've heard great things from everybody, she was an extremely human person to work for, and it was, of course, the greatest privilege of my life.
My Lords, I'm grateful to Lord Wakeham. May I say that I had a very long association with Mrs. Thatcher, and I'd like to begin by associating myself with the regrets and the very considerable concern we all have for her family, and in that context I would like to include her grandchildren as well as her direct son and daughter. Mrs. Thatcher and I followed one another at Somerville College, Oxford, She became the first woman chairman, I think, of the Oxford University Conservative Association, and I came 5 years later to be the first woman leader of the Oxford University Labour Club. Somerville was a cradle for prime ministers, including Mrs. Gandhi and many others, and it was one that very much embodied and understood Mrs. Thatcher, because Mrs. Thatcher, above all, and this is the first serious point I want to make, was somebody of most incredible single-mindedness, determination, dedication, and self-discipline. I think in my entire political life I have never met anybody who combined those four qualities in the way that she did. From the very beginning, she knew what she wanted to be, what she wanted to do, and she managed to overcome virtually every obstacle one can think of. So far in the speeches that we've heard, including the very moving one from the noble Lord Tevitt, we haven't heard quite enough, I think, about the extraordinary patriarchal nature of British politics in 1960s and 70s. It was not easy to put yourself forward as a leader of the party or a prime minister later in those days. Our society was still a deeply masculine one, and one where for any woman to stand up was to open herself to patronage, to the assumption that she was of a second level of intellect, and all the rest that went with that. It's important, I think, to say, and I hope say it with respect, but with some memory of what things were really like, that, for example, the Prime Minister, Mr. Heath, was clearly not too happy to have that particular woman in his cabinet, and rather cleverly seated her 5 seats away from him in the cabinet so that she couldn't be seen if she got up and tried to speak. We remembered after that she had, in addition to this extraordinary capacity to overcome and even not notice in some ways the objections that were raised to her as a woman. And of course the assumption when Erin Eve took over her campaign for leadership was that she would be most unlikely on those grounds ever to succeed. In that context, it's perhaps worth telling myself one anecdote. According to Mr. Thatcher, Sir Dennis Thatcher, at one stage he was sitting at home in his flat in Flood Street, and Mrs. Thatcher was ironing his shirt, something she was very keen on doing, getting breakfast, ironing his shirt. And she said in a sort of rather casual way, "Dennis, I'm thinking of running for the leadership." To which he responded, "Leadership of what, Margaret?" Now, that somehow summed up the wonderful balance, detachment and humour of Sir Dennis, and I can't underline too strongly the extent to which I think Mrs. Thatcher began to lose her life when he passed away. He was absolutely central and key to her whole personality, her ability to become what she was. The second thing I think I want to stress, and it's very important, was something mentioned by my noble friend Lord Ashdown, and that was her astonishing courage. Many people, including not least, of course, Lord Tevitt, will recall the courage that she showed and then sustained on their behalf throughout the whole of the Brighton episode. But let's pause for a minute and notice the courage it took, the daring it took, to actually take on the Falklands 8,000 miles away, with the likelihood that we were going to be badly beaten. She knew she had, in a sense, nothing to lose and everything to gain. But it was still an extraordinary decision to make by a woman who was leading what was to some extent at that point a divided cabinet. But I want to say one other thing as well. There's a great danger that we will sanctify Mrs. Thatcher. She wouldn't want that at all. She was always a great warrior. When she and I were in opposite positions as both Secretaries of State for Education, and I was her opponent, she wasn't somebody who tried to pretend that there was no difference between us. She loved it. She relished argument. She relished confrontation. And she would relish it now in this House if we didn't fail to refer to that as an aspect of her personality and her being. There was another side to it, and I share the views of some that have expressed them. I think her policies were terribly hard on the industrial North and the industrial Midlands. I think her policies did not completely reflect the common ground that we were beginning to develop as a multicultural and multiracial nation. And to me that is a very important part of what we are today. It was very interesting, however, that she was essentially a deeply pragmatic politician, as I think the Baroness Royal pointed out. Let me make just 2 points in that respect. She never, ever took on those things that were essentially accepted fundamentally by the British people. She never attempted to roll back comprehensive education. She approved more comprehensive schools than I ever did. She never attempted to take on the National Health Service and turn it into a privatised service, because she knew where the British people stood, and she never forgot the reality of politics. Let me conclude by just saying this. She was unquestionably one of the most remarkable prime ministers of her century and of the world at that time. She was also somebody who found it hard to get her mind around globalisation. Don't forget that she opposed, for example, the unification of Germany, which was key to the creation of a truly democratic Europe, West and East, in the period after the Cold War. And we shouldn't go too far to say that she and Ronald Reagan brought that about. They made a major contribution. But there was, of course, somebody called Mikhail Gorbachev, who showed astonishing courage in the way in which he took on the attempt to try to change the nature of the Soviet Union. I don't want to take any more time up. There are many great speeches to be heard, and they've heard already some outstanding speeches. But I do want to say, for courage, for single-mindedness, for determination, there are a few who matched Mrs. Thatcher. History, I think, will certainly see her reputation change in some ways. That always happens in history. But I don't think she will ever be forgotten.
Listening to the radio and watching television in the Isle of Wight, I was struck by the number of Conservatives at Westminster who said that Margaret Thatcher had brought them into politics, and some even suggested that they'd been Thatcherites long before she even came to power. Although I served with her in opposition and in government for 15 years in succession, I make neither claim. Mine was a rather different journey. In the leadership of 1975, I voted for Ted Heath, and I then followed this up with voting for my right honourable friend, Lord Howe. It's fair to say that that was a rather exclusive campaign. We had 25 definite promises and pledges, and we ended up with 19 votes. That being entirely par for the course for House of Commons elections. But we had some very good quality. We had my noble friend Lord Britton and my old friend Kenneth Clarke. And as we chewed over the result in a small room upstairs, none of us were convinced that the party had made the right choice. It was then, to my total amazement, that Margaret Thatcher put me into her first shadow cabinet. And I think it's fair to say that amazement was widely shared. I had never done a front bench job before, and I was put in charge of health and social security against Barbara Castle. I think that is known as a baptism of fire. But it proved a point about my noble friend. Margaret was sometimes seen as surrounding herself with known supporters and yes-men. She had the confidence and the self-belief not to do that. As noble Lord Armstrong said, you didn't have to be one of us to be in her cabinets. All three of us at that time were doubters, but all three of us became members of her cabinets, and our candidate, our very good candidate, who sadly only got 19 votes, became her very excellent Chancellor of the Exchequer, to whom she owed so much. The second point I remember was that she was personally kind and generous, and much concerned that her ministers should not lose out in any way. I learnt about that in a rather roundabout way. After about 18 months, I was moved from health and social security to transport. It was not the move that I was looking for. What's transport? I said to Margaret indignantly. Norman, she said, I did transport, you can do transport. So that's exactly what happened. And it proved to be a lucky move, for when the new government was formed, I went into the cabinet, never being a junior minister even before. But Margaret Thatcher had a very lengthy apology to make. I'm afraid, she said, we can only pay in full 22 cabinet ministers
and you are 23. So we're going to have to pay you at the rate of the Chief Whip, Lord Joplin, who is somewhere around. I'm really, she said, very, very sorry about that. I thought it was best not to say that probably I would have done it for nothing, had she asked, but we moved on from that. I was fascinated by what the noble Lord Armstrong said about the visit of President Mitterrand to Downing Street. He was lucky. He had a socialist. My opposite number was a communist, Monsieur Fitterman. But the great thing was that after all these great events, you need a communique. And there wasn't actually, it was a very genial meeting, but there was nothing much we could agree on. But the one thing we could agree on, at least in principle, was the need for a Channel tunnel. And the communique became about the Channel tunnel. It ceased to be just an aspiration of the Department of Transport. It became a proposal of number 10, and it was from that moment onwards that it went onwards. And the third point I make is this. I look back on those years. They were momentous years. There were undoubted tragedies, like the Grand Hotel bomb. I remember as Health Secretary going back to Brighton the very next morning. I was there the night before, going back the very next morning to visit some of the wounded. And I remember, if I may say so, the courage of those people, not least the two lords who are here today. And there were undoubted crises like the Falklands. It's the only time I ever remember Margaret Thatcher going round the whole of the cabinet table and asking each minister, one by one, whether they were in favour of the task force going. And virtually everyone agreed, only one with one exception. But I'm bound to say, we agreed, at least I agreed, with metaphorically my fingers crossed, because I joined the army for my national service in 1956 at the time of Suez. Suez was not our greatest time, and if we couldn't get our forces efficiently from Cyprus to Egypt, it seemed to me very difficult to get them to the other end of the world in the way that we did it. But the success of the Falklands was a tribute to a totally professional armed forces, but it was also a tribute to the consistency, the determination and the courage of Margaret Thatcher herself. And my lesson from that was that the MPs who had voted for her in 1975 as leader, they had been proved absolutely correct and right in that decision. Above all, I think serving with Margaret Thatcher was always exciting. It was sometimes also great fun. Some say she stamped all over her ministers, and it's true that if you were prepared to be handbagged, she would oblige. She did not respect the ministers who came in with a proposal which they immediately withdrew, having heard the initial response from the Prime Minister. What I learned very early on was that she really did enjoy an argument. And sometimes you actually won that argument as well. She was an activist, she was a radical, and she was above all a leader. Her death is obviously a terribly sad occasion, and we all send our sympathies to Carol and Mark and the family. But above all, in my view, these days should be a recognition and a celebration of a great woman.
My lords, I had the privilege. My lords, I had the privilege.
I know there is something of an enthusiasm for making contributions which we all welcome, but just having a little few sotto voce conversations, I think that going round the groups, it now looks as though my noble friend Lord Waddington might actually go next, given his service to the government. Then noble Lord Williamson, the crossbenchers, the noble Lord Griffiths, who has been patiently waiting for some time, I know, my noble friend Lord King, the noble Lord Burt again from the crossbenchers, and then my noble friend, my noble and learned friend, the Lord Mackay of Clashfern, before we then return to other benches. And I'm most grateful, I have to say, to the Leader of Opposition for giving me advance notice of some of those on her own benches who yet hope to speak.
I shall try to be brief, my lords, and I'm not going to add to the catalogue of her great achievements. I may wish to indulge in one or two rather personal reminiscences which throw some light on her character. She came up to help me in the Clitheroe by-election in February 1974, and it was a very cold day, and after an hour or two we repaired to a place to have lunch. I sat down the constituency chairman on her left, who was so intimidated by the occasion that he couldn't think of anything to say for 5 minutes. He then burst into song and said, Leader of the Opposition, don't you think it's time we went for PR? I thought the Leader of the Opposition would explode. She choked on her spring cocktail and gave a great gulp and then said, well, of course you never want the Tory party to win another election. That's a very good idea. And the constituency chairman slumped into his sleep and never said another word. She didn't suffer fools gladly, but she could be immensely kind, sometimes very tolerant of ordinary human failings. I read the other day a book written by Carol Thatcher, and I, like others, wish to give my condolences to the family. And in that book about her father, Carol said that she asked her father one day what was his what was his idea of the perfect afternoon. And he said, well, it's sitting in a deck chair on a hot afternoon with a bottle of bubbly by my side, reading a good book, and Margaret in a reasonably calm frame of mind. Well, you have to say that Margaret wasn't always absolutely calm when you were working with her. She was always challenging, always relishing a good argument, and sometimes when you had endured the flame and the fire, you came out of it thinking you might have won. You were never quite sure. She was a towering figure, but I have to say that I saw signs of human frailty. I was with her behind the stage in the conference hall at Brighton in 1984. She was waiting to go in front to make her great speech. She was slumped on the sofa, and I think it was Gordon Rees was sitting on the arm of the sofa, and Margaret was saying, I don't think I can go through with this. And he said, of course you can, of course you can. When you get out in front there, the whole world will be cheering for you. And so it was. She went in front of that audience and he gave one of the most marvellous speeches of her whole life. Margaret was absolutely free of side and self-importance. Once I had an argument with her as to whether the BBC licence fee had been discussed in various committee meetings we'd had on the broadcasting bill. I said I was absolutely sure that the licence fee had never been mentioned. She said she was sure it had. The minutes were called for. A man came into the room with a great bundle of documents. She seized the documents, threw them on the floor, and flung herself on the floor to read them, begging me to join her. After 3 or 4 minutes of fruitless search, somebody knocked on the door and came in, and seeing this extraordinary sight might have been quite embarrassed. Margaret wasn't at all embarrassed. She got to her feet, very much full of bad temper, not embarrassment, flounced out of the room saying that the discussion would soon be resumed and she'd soon prove how pathetic was my memory. She was a great person to work with, and I'm immensely proud to have had the opportunity of serving under her.
I've been invited from the crossbenches to join with all the tributes to Baroness Thatcher, as I worked closely with her for some years. And my memories of those years are very vivid, not surprisingly, as Margaret Thatcher was never in the half light, but always in the full light of events. And my admiration for her is as strong as ever. There are many noble lords here whose political responsibilities and political careers were very closely associated with Margaret Thatcher, and their tributes are weightier than mine. But my tribute is from the point of view of a civil servant who briefed her and accompanied her to very many summit and high-level meetings in the often tense and frequently contentious area of European affairs. It was both a pleasure and a challenge to work with her. A pleasure because, contrary to the popular impression, she always listened very carefully to briefing and did not make up her mind until she had heard the facts and arguments. It is only after that stage that she became the Iron Lady. It was a challenge because she rightly judged the issues on the overriding criterion, is it in the British interest? And so did I. And not on other factors, such as pressure from other EU states or from other institutions. Among the issues, arguments, and indeed rows of my time with Margaret Thatcher was the battle to obtain and the process of obtaining the budget rebate, which I believe has so far brought home about £70 billion for the United Kingdom taxpayer. In the light of later events, which are not relevant to the session today, you cannot imagine how strongly she argued for two objectives, not one, but two, which was first money and secondly the requirement of unanimity, so that the UK had a veto if there were any later attempts by others to take away or reduce the rebate. Both these objectives she obtained. In the course of this, I learnt a lot about disagreements. It is therefore also a pleasure to me that, although all my own papers are now lost deep in the archives, I still have somewhere a piece of torn green blotting paper on which, after a discussion between Margaret Thatcher and myself in the margins of a European Council, she wrote, "I agree, Margaret Thatcher," and then again, "I agree, Margaret Thatcher." In the field of European affairs, it may not be unique, but it is certainly rare.
If I may just draw your Lordship's attention to an entirely different aspect of the noble Lady Thatcher's life and character, it would be to mention her origins, and mention has been made of that by the noble prelate, the Bishop of Oxford, as a good Methodist. She was born in Grantham in the county of Lincoln, and of course in that same county at Epworth, John Wesley was himself born. It was into a very devout Methodist home that she was born, and the pieties and the religious practices of that home, as well as the values and the principles, were early learned in that way. She had them processed into her very being, I believe. Indeed, I shared views about that later on in her life with herself. So I want to just register where she comes from in terms of the primordial energies that shaped her character. She came down to London to pursue her career, although let it be said that whilst at Oxford, as well as her scientific career. She was part of a preaching team that went around the villages near Oxford to take the gospel and to pronounce good news, and some of those who were in the team with her are still alive and will tell you their own tales. If only we could get the Appointments Commission to bring them into your Lordship's house, they'd regale you with many a tale. So I believe that it's not just to stand here to introduce an element that is artificially drawn in, granted the grand themes that have already been adumbrated in previous speeches, but to say something about something that was essentially her. She was married, she and Dennis, at Wesley's Chapel, where I have the privilege to be the minister, and Carol and Mark were baptized there a little later. And she had an enduring fondness for the chapel, came back regularly. I say to many visitors who come our way that if they want to look at the handsome communion rail that was given to us by Margaret Thatcher, it will be the kind of evidence that everybody needs that she did, despite all those who say the opposite, actually help some people to their feet. It's just worth noticing that as a vice president of the Friends of Wesley's Chapel, she was a faithful friend, although, of course, as many Methodists do, she was translated into the other place, namely the Church of England, and made that her spiritual dwelling place on a regular basis. I know that I would have loved to have shared with her my feelings about her quotation of a sermon by John Wesley when she was in Edinburgh. It was a sermon on money, and of course she was well known to have her own views about money, and I think that she wanted to draw John Wesley very much into her own thinking and to make him suit her purpose, because she quoted 2 points of John Wesley's sermon: that it was the responsibility of all Christians to earn all they can. Well, that's all right. And to save all they can. Although, as I can personally attest, at 0.5% interest rate, that's not much point these days. But she omitted the third point of John Wesley's argument, which was that having earned and having saved, good Christian people should be altruists and spend all they can and give all they can for the common good. She was a great friend, as I say. It's interesting that as well as being the minister of the church where her marriage service took place, I happen to be an honorary canon of the cathedral where her funeral service will take place, and I shall be there next Wednesday in that capacity. I know that there are many points upon which I disagreed fundamentally with her. When she came, for example, to open one of the 2 museums that we have on our site, this was in 1981, and things weren't going well for her at that time. And many of us who championed the cause of the poor and were very radical young Methodists, we were out there shouting the odds and sounding a different music from what was being sounded inside the building which she was at that time opening. She was as well briefed for a humble visit to the Methodist chapel as she ever was on matters of policy in the ways that had been alluded to here in previous speeches. She knew the answers, even though us who were there all the time often didn't. But it's just strange. God has a sense of humour, or whatever you want to substitute, whatever noble and secular laws want to substitute for God. There is a sense of humour at the heart of things that this young Turk, asking for this chapel to be pulled down and the money raised, given to the poor, is now the minister of the very chapel that he wanted to be destroyed and disposed of. But she was a friend to the end. She wanted to come to church the week after their 50th wedding anniversary. Unfortunately, she suffered a stroke in the course of a short holiday she was taking in Madeira at the time and wasn't able to come. So I count it a great privilege to have known her just a little. She was, when she exchanged opinions with me, for example, about South Africa, at a crucial stage in its life. She said, the chief's the man, meaning, of course, Buthelezi of the Inkatha Freedom Party, and she couldn't have been, could she, more wrong. But at the same time, she did things which we, on our benches, I suspect, would be glad that she did, because there were things we'd have liked to have done, but didn't perhaps have the right positioning to do. So it's a very complex character. history will tell. But she was a larger-than-life character. The inhabitants of the county of Lincoln are known popularly as yellow bellies. She wasn't one of those.